caritas or charity in the world of political entities. That translates into a notion of responsibility. One may well have a responsibility to one's neighbor, a responsibility to protect the innocent from certain harm. And this pre-Westphalian argument locates political bodies as a feature of our world, our fallen world, but does not infuse them with the same high normativity later associated with the Westphalian settlement. To be sure, Augustine understands full well the need for rule and governance. Anarchy is a horror. No one should scorn the creation and the sustaining of polities. At the same time, the good they do needs to be kept in perspective. The city of man is not and can never be the city of God. It follows that God's creatures, or some of them, may be called upon to fight and even to die to protect other of God's creatures who have come in harm's way. It will, in other words, it seems to me, be somewhat easier, not easy, but somewhat easier to arrive at justification for preemption where rescue is concerned with this Augustinian ambience in play, rather than under what Professor Walzer calls the legal or the legalist paradigm. But intervention is not automatic. Augustine is well aware of the fact that rulers can deploy moral argument where the motive for force is instead aggrandizement. There are ways to assess this, of course. Does the ruler intervene and then seize territory? Does he perpetrate his own egregious cruelties? And so on. The proof always is in the pudding. So to sum up this bit, for the just war thinkers, save perhaps the most narrowly legalistic, and here I think one is more likely to run into this kind of highly legalistic argument from critics of just war, rather than from just war thinkers themselves. But save for those in that camp, preemption can be justified, but a rigorous argument is required, and the decision arrived at will always be, or should always be, articulated with some regret that such rescue or humanitarian intervention, or alternatively measures to forestall an imminent attack are necessary. In other words, one makes it clear that preemption is not just another day at the office, but is instead undertaken in a specific moment of crisis. Prevention is another matter, and here the barrier to action is set higher. Some just war thinkers make that barrier unscalable. Prevention can never be justified. Others lower it somewhat, arguing that there are some new things in the world that just war thinkers must now contend with. So we go to a question about whether prevention undermines international norms. Now, an argument deployed frequently against the possibility of prevention, and remember that prevention means dealing with a threat before it is fully realized and imminent, is that it will set off a cascading series of preventive measures or interventions, a kind of domino effect. If prevention is resorted to by the United States, say, does that not set a precedent for other states, for a small state in sub-Saharan Africa to attack its neighbor under the pretext that it will soon be a preeminent threat to themselves? I'm under the impression that many of these states require no such pretext. They seem to have little trouble at all attacking and attempting to destroy one another, although much continuing violence is most often meted out most brutally to one's own people or portions of one's own people. Now, for those functioning largely outside a morally robust just war tradition, whether preventive action is engaged in or not will turn primarily on a set of calculations of benefit to be gained and losses to be endured. Within just war teaching, as we have already learned, the matter is not reducible to such calculations. Do we locate state sovereignty so high that the barrier to violating it cannot be breached, or instead are there urgencies that may justify prevention? Now, in my view, And I approach this with some trepidation, but in my view, prevention should have a status not unlike that of supreme emergency in Walzer's Just and Unjust Wars. And by that I mean it should be resorted to with tremendous regret and only when there is no reasonable alternative. Now, I fear this may mislead somewhat. Walzer's supreme emergency, the overriding of the norm of discrimination in a situation where whole peoples and not just states hang in the balance, is controversial in part because, according to his critics, he creates a new category, in effect. Many have argued, or did, that this invites that domino effect that I talked about a moment ago. But Walzer can reasonably claim at this juncture that one can detect no such thing in the actions of policymakers since the publication of his book in 1977. Those who are going to embark on a course of outright aggression and killing, like Saddam Hussein against the Kurds, for example, are unlikely to find it necessary to make the case on moral grounds and to deploy the criterion of supreme emergency. Rather, it is a simple case of the mighty doing what they will and the weak suffering what they must. Now, prevention, I think, is not as controversial as supreme emergency. I suspect that's the case, but my reason for associating the two is that prevention should be rare, not normative, and can be justified only when the developing threat is of such a dire nature that we simply cannot take the chance that it will become imminent. And the we here is likely not to be one nation alone. Let's return to my example of Iran's nuclear program. Everyone agrees, the European Union agrees, others agree it would be a catastrophe by any measure were Iran to go nuclear. Other Arab states in the Middle East, I should say, shake in their boots as they contemplate this possible reality. Israel's life as a polity is at stake if one takes Ahmadinejad's words seriously. He has told us repeatedly that he will obliterate the Zionist entity at the first opportunity, and has gone on to say surely tens of thousands of Muslims may die, but they would die a glorious death as martyrs, so it is an occasion for rejoicing. Now, is this just so much hot air? Will no such thing ever happen? We do not know. So how do we act? Do we pretend not to hear any of this? Do we regard it automatically as rhetorical hyperbole and downgrade its importance? Or do we take it seriously and, running worst-case scenarios, determine we must act before the threat is actualized? As I indicated, this will be rare, this sort of situation, for it is not the stuff of day-to-day international relations. The state system works to maintain a kind of homeostasis most of the time, the famous balancing business that is the stuff of realist discourse, and there is something to that. So prevention will be rare, as such threats are going to be rare. Now, there are many who would say, why strain so mightily to arrive at some thin justification, strained and morally ambiguous justification, for what so obviously needs to be done in the name of state security, the security of one's own people, if not the security of others. A nuclearized Iran may not present an immediate threat once it is achieved, but it will direct to us, but it will directly threaten the stability of the Middle East, hence the world, and of our own security. Thus, both raison d'etat and reasons of state dictate prevention, so why agonize about it? This argument has some force, but the just war thinker would fret that it bodes to make prevention more normative or common than it ought to be. Thus, he or she insists that just war prohibition on prevention must be considered, can it ever be overridden, and if not prohibition, then a high barrier thereto, can it be overridden? I would argue, yes, but with great temerity and caution, as one in no way wants such arguments to become commonplace. I actually do not think they will become such. No one, including the United States, wants to run around trying to nip every possible threat in the bud.